So today, I just want to share some personal experiences, stories, and information with you that kind of come from a holistic and bi-directional, meaning internal and external and relational lens, integrating aspects of both faith and psychology in my experience and around these concepts of compassion and in specifically self-compassion. So start with Genesis 1. I believe this really shares a story that from creation, from the beginning, that we are good. In fact, it says very good, and that this is our beginning of sacred connection. This is our grounding. This is the anchor. Now, from another perspective, from the moment a baby is born, they become really vulnerable to the outside world and really rely on it to meet their needs. And I believe that God created us to be in connection with each other and the land and the earth so that we may be able to experience this sacred goodness through compassion. We need this, what I call co-regulation, and co-regulation is the warm responsiveness of sending and receiving a felt sense of safety from another in order to understand, express, and modulate their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And so what happens if there are circumstances, things like maybe a caregiver, they're not able to provide this co-regulation because their nervous systems are not regulated themselves and continued over time and other traumatic events or maybe inherited historical and intergenerational trauma blocks that ability to know what these feelings of warmth and safety and connection with others feels like. Well, we become disembodied. And so your body and mind connection may become primarily focused on surviving and not belonging. You may learn, or maybe belonging is part of surviving. I think our systems are always trying to do both. You may learn to distrust any of your internal experiences, perceiving those as threats. You might learn to disconnect from that sacred goodness inside of you. And you might feel really alone. You're on your own to try to make sense. In fact, that feels safer of why this disconnect is happening. And parts of you learn to develop ways to cope with that. And these parts give you a certainty, a sense of certainty and control in these situations that might be scary or really distressing. You might develop and even reinforce over time a story that something's wrong with you, or that you're bad or damaged, things like that. And you might over-identify with it because you don't know any different experiences or ways to make sense of things because we're meaning-making machines. We lose like a wider focus on environmental things that might contribute to our distress and suffering. So for most of my life, I felt like something was off. I consistently was experiencing overwhelm, anxiety, and my survival responses were that I focused on agreeing with everyone else, what we call fawning. I also recognized I did some hurtful things to others along the way, maybe the fighting response, or shutting down, freezing, and avoiding any distress, what we might call the flight response. Anything that kept me from feeling internal distress. And in order to be loved and connect meant to trust what others said was the truth because I didn't trust myself or what was inside of me. I was bad or wrong. And this helped me at that time. This is also why psychology really intrigued me. I could learn the answers to fix the wrong and bad in myself and others. And the message of Jesus was also intriguing. He loved me so much, right? That's what I needed. And the message of original sin was confirming what I believed about myself, that I was bad. I sought whatever things would help me fix the bad. and not seeing the good parts of me. The message of original sin was mixed with hopes found in things like the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And the thought of those resonated deep inside of me. But I was confused with other messages I was hearing. These, though, still became what I valued, and I wanted more in my life. And I thought the way to get that would be to just cognitively believe in God, right? If I just believed, I could be saved from all my bad self and experience more of this fruit. And when I wanted reprieve from shaming and blaming myself, I took on the belief that these experiences were also the enemy outside of me, some person attacking me, which further fueled my fear. I continued to seek deliverance prayers because I thought I needed to be delivered from some deep evil spirit inside of me. Now also understanding that these people, good intentioned, didn't understand much about trauma or even the impact of colonization. It wasn't until I moved away from my family and church that I experienced the greatest suffering. I moved to Canada a few years ago, and my levels of anxiety were at an all-time high. I started experiencing more physical pain in my body, really uncomfortable sensations, and the stories and ways of thinking and believing I had up until this point were not enough to help me deal with what was happening, make sense of it, or get rid of it, which is what I thought I wanted and what I was being taught in both psychology and church communities. Well, thank goodness, I was able to experience a felt sense of co-regulation and compassion from my internship director, who at that time just held space for all the things that I was experiencing. And I could feel the confidence he had in me that I would get through it, and extended the belief that nothing was wrong with me. This is also when I learned about this concept of self-compassion. And along with that, during the pandemic, was at the same time understanding what trauma, collective trauma, and all those things can do to the nervous system. Well, Dr. Kristen Neff defines compassion as the means to suffer with. First, to have compassion, you must notice that others are suffering. And second, it involves feeling moved by others' suffering, so your heart responds to their pain. When this occurs, you feel warmth, caring, and the desire to help that suffering person in some way. Having compassion also means that you offer understanding and kindness to others when they fail or make mistakes, rather than judging them harshly. Grace. Finally, when you feel compassion for another rather than mere pity, it means you realize that the suffering, failure, and imperfection is part of our shared human experience. And so in that way, self-compassion is those things towards ourselves and our own parts. 1, having self-kindness versus self-judgment. 2, realizing that we all share this common humanity versus isolation, that it's just something about me. And 3, mindfulness, being present in the here and the now versus over-identifying, which is what those other parts like to do. So this concept blew me away, connected with me deeply, and resonated with the ways of Jesus loving and living that I had heard about. This is where I really began my deconstruction, existential crisis, decolonization process, and questioned everything that I knew before. Things like, why hadn't any Christian spaces talked about this idea of self-compassion, especially since both faith and psychology want to reduce suffering in people. I was thankful psychology was able to name the experiences I was going through. In fact, self-compassion also can come from other religions like Buddhism, right? That I was taught were wrong. And there was only one way, right? And even though psychology was able to name these experiences, it was also perpetuating this dynamic that problems only stem within individual people. And how come these church spaces, I experienced some moments of compassion that I felt, and they didn't want to talk more about this? Why were the people I used to associate with from church agreeing with systems and ways of thinking that harm people, but preach a message about this unconditional universal love for everyone, yet not really creating space for these conversations or providing truly safe and welcoming spaces and love for everyone? Why were they so resistant when I brought up things about human responses? Well, I noticed more and more there was still judgment about who was considered worthy of being called a Christian, and I noticed the judgment I had about myself that I carried for a long time. My own rigid beliefs were created by parts of me that only knew one way to connect and really wanted to keep me from experiencing distress, pain, or suffering. But it was also reinforcing that I could avoid pain and suffering and discomfort instead of being met with compassion and confidence that I could move through it and connect with those parts of me inside or people outside that could, help me move through it. My family and church systems would verbally say that love is the answer, yet my lived experience was void of compassion often, which disconnected from the message that Jesus is with us and suffered for us. And I think this is a necessary component of his love, in my opinion. So I began to really learn about this concept of original goodness. I started to realize that there were certain interpretations of what it meant to be Christian, and that there was other ways to make sense of what it meant to be a human in this life that both embraces the real humanness and the goodness that was in the beginning in Genesis. I learned a different narrative story that didn't start with the foundation of believing I was bad by nature, but created from goodness. I also know I caused hurt and harm, so it's not about dismissing that, and I, like me and other humans, were capable of this. But it also means that the core parts of me, they're not coming from a bad place. I realize that trauma and the reactions, by nature, it is a full body experience that disconnects us from overwhelming internal experiences for survival. Trauma is a wound that needs to be witnessed. It is not what happened to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. It's when our resources, internal and external, go beyond our current capacity to cope. So I continue to choose to create space and time to look inwards with curiosity and ask, where are my actions lining up with my values and where were they not? And where were certain beliefs causing me to over-identify with the shame story and therefore project that onto other people? I noticed I didn't have to get rid of any of these thoughts and feelings. And actually, by being with them while connecting internally and even externally at times to the felt sense of compassion, I could see other perspectives and stories. I wasn't blended. I don't have to spend all my time and mental capacity to problem solve for every worst case scenario all the time and kind of constantly live in this reaction to fear. I could increase my capacity to live and experience the fruit of the Spirit as a byproduct of embodying and connecting with self-compassion to that warm, safe, sacred goodness that is already inside of all of us. I didn't need to live in those survival states all the time. And since I know what this new experience of goodness feels like, I could do this with other people more. Although it took a long time to trust this unfamiliar feeling, I don't try to fix others as much anymore because I don't have the basic belief that we're bad. I believe we have human experiences that cause burdens, and by having compassion, that willing to suffer with these parts and people, the burden lifts, and that we all can experience the fruit of the Spirit of the living God. One thing that was important is that healing is not a linear thing. It doesn't go from here and we arrive. It's a journey of connecting back to the sacred within us, that original goodness of creation that God made. But I still catch myself at times feeling fear that I'm doing something wrong. And even this week, I was talking to Glenn about this message. It was present because it was different. It was uncomfortable. And that there's no one right way to do something, right? And that it's helpful to name the discomfort and notice that shame story that's trying to take over. And now I do things to help me stay very present, that I can, when connected to this sacred, compassionate within, I can get through it and I don't stay stuck there. So I want to invite you right now, if you want, to experience some of this. So just take a moment, just right where you are. You can use a piece of paper if you're an artist and you have those things readily available. But really, this is just an invitation to be right now with all the parts of us. Just take a second to pause and tune in. You can close your eyes if that's comfortable. Also, some of us don't feel comfortable doing that. So whatever works for you. Take a second to pause, allow, and pay attention to what is internal. Just begin inside to name and notice with curiosity any sensations, thoughts, or feelings in your body with that curiosity. Do you feel hotness or tingling or heaviness? And just practice giving these things permission to be there. You don't have to like it, but accept that this is what you're noticing in this moment and that you're not alone. Maybe even extending some gratitude for these parts of you, even if they feel negative. And consider this: there's no bad parts of you. Those parts were created from a good place, but you've experienced suffering and maybe picked up beliefs that maybe have helped you during that season of your life. And maybe you're no longer connected with your values or the person you want to be, and could be harming yourself or other people.